You are the first participant to join the conference.
If you're the meeting host, enter the host PIN followed by pound. If you're not the host, press pound. If you're the meeting host, enter the host PIN followed by pound. If you're not the host, press pound.
Says something about network connection problems may be causing poor visual. But it says connected. So are you seeing me? Are you hearing me?
Let me jump back with the plugged into the Ethernet, or are you on their Wi-Fi?
I'm on the Ethernet.
Okay, I see you. And I can hear you as well.
Okay,
You
great.
just did that.
Okay,
And your picture looks good.
good. Okay, I'm going to disconnect. Okay, it's unmuted.
Okay.
I just checked my videos and they're up and running.
And we can see the video run, but I didn't hear any audio.
I heard it here. Yeah, I just had it. I had it muted, but it played through the room here. You ready to hear it?
Okay, it's unmuted. Okay, we hear you coming through. Okay. They're coming up right now.
Can you hear it?
Keep your audio. It's really faint audio.
I turned it down because it was loud.
Okay. Hey, are you showing naked men?
Yeah, but he's got fuzziness over him.
Why?
It's a talk on how people can get psychotic on illegal drugs, and this man is naked, but he also busts through a fence and gets sprayed with pepper spray, and it doesn't even faze him. It's a crazy video.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a crazy video.
We're good. Okay. We're good. Yeah, I think
I'm still
I think we're good.
I'm still having a bit of trouble getting these things to advance, though. Well, I guess it's okay. It's just slow. I think it's the transition he has in his presentation.
And that could be, and you just started that machine up, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. I think. I pray.
I think you are. I think we're good. I think you go and put up your intro slide.
Okay.
And everything sounded good in the room, right?
Yeah, everything sounds good in the room.
Okay. It's a little more faint on the stream, but
I can turn it up. Can you hear me okay?
yeah, you sound great.
Okay.
Welcome to a Cisco meeting. You are entering the meeting
You
now.
still have other things that you have to work on there?
This meeting is being recorded. You are
Yeah,
the
a little
only
bit. I just
participant.
need to get a sign-in sheet.
Okay.
Should be in
Go
there.
ahead and pull up your
Well, actually, I think I may have forgotten it. We may just need a piece of paper.
presentation.
Because Alan took them all out.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Good. Sorry, I'm trying to double task. All good.
Yeah.
Contractor at my place, so for the rest of the house.
Okay. Okay.
Just gonna snag. The new guy who took over for other people work is here 2 weeks.
Hey, Tia,
Yeah.
I'm gonna hang up.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much.
No, you're fine.
Appreciate
Text me
you.
if you need anything.
All right, I will do.
Okay, thanks, bye.
Where did my PETOS slide go?
spent a lot of time with IT comments. So appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, no, this is like,
It's fresh for you.
this should be right up my alley. Yeah, I was trying to get, we had the sulfur dioxide bring out, coolers, some other ones like last year where we get calls from hospitals who found out about it, went, sorry, what?
Yeah.
We eventually get the information. We get the information sooner.
Come on in, you guys.
I'm unmuting now, so we're officially being heard. I'm probably not tall enough to yet. There we go. Right. Hi, you guys. For those of you joining us online, I'd like to welcome you to our monthly Pediatric EMS Lecture Outreach Series. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Michael Moss join us. He is the somewhat recently arrived medical director of the Poison Control Center here at University of Utah, and a toxicologist and an emergency medicine physician. So he's going to talk to us today about some new psychoactive substances that our pediatric population is using and how to manage those kids when you come across them. So thank you so much, and here's Dr. Moss. And for those of you online, as always, we will get you your CME credit after the talk is done. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure to be here, guys. I got just coming up on 1 year since I started here. You may have come across me in the ER at the U, but I'm only there about once a week or so. But otherwise, I'm on call about half the time for the Poison Center. So I'll hear about all the cases you guys are finding. And a lot of what we're talking about today applies to kids because they like to experiment, but this also applies pretty much across the entire population as far as what's out there. It's a common question we get at the Poison Center is what kind of new fancy drugs are on the street and what are you seeing? Which usually I have a question of it depends, but this will give you an overview of what are all the sorts of things that could be out there and what could that actually look like in a patient. If you remember nothing else about all these different drugs we're going to cover, just realize we never actually know what someone took despite what they might tell us. Things are different, they're adulterated, they're switched around, people don't know. So we're going to treat the patient just like how they look, right? That's what we'll fix. It's easy for patients to overdose because these aren't coming in nicely defined tablets that are this many milligrams and they have no idea how much they're taking, and so they may go overboard. I think we don't have a lot of antidotes for much of any of this. So if anyone has CNS or respiratory depression, naloxone is always a reasonable thing to try, which I know you guys do all the time anyway. Otherwise, it's supportive care, which we'll go over a bit more specifically. If you have a question and your protocols allow, we're always happy to talk to you at the Poison Center. If you have a concern about something, give us a call. We usually pick up the phone right away and get you some information about an unusual substance or identifying a pill or telling you what in the world is this thing someone said they took. We can get you some ideas, and we're always happy to help. I guess some definitions of things to start is what in the world is a novel psychoactive substance? This term has kind of come around in the last several years to vaguely define a whole group of different drugs. We used to use the term like designer drug, which is trying to make synthetic drugs to get around laws and things like that. But it's not all brand new drugs. Sometimes it's really old stuff that was, made in labs in the 50s and 60s that people come up with again. And then it's this ever-going kind of arms race, whack-a-mole of one thing's outlawed, and so they change one atom and come up with something new. And many times these aren't technically illegal, is that they're not actually listed on the Controlled Substance Act that the DEA has said this is a Schedule I drug. They're often related to these, and they may technically be able to become illegal once they go through a process, but they're often in this legal gray area. There was some efforts quite a while ago, heyday of our war on drugs, of the Federal Analog Act, to try to get ahead of some of this. We still have never really won the game. What they said is anything that's an analog of a controlled substance, right? If you had meth, but you changed one thing on it, so it's mostly meth, that's a controlled substance analog, and it's substantially similar. And that third bullet is kind of defines all the reaches of these new drugs of abuse. It has a stimulant, depressant, or hallucinogenic effect on the central nervous system. And then there's a super weird loophole baked into the law, which I don't know where they came up with this or why, but it says, well, unless if it's not intended for human consumption, then I guess it really isn't a controlled substance. And so that has led to everything being labeled as not for human consumption. Look, we get around the law. It doesn't actually work like that, right? They know your intent of what are people actually distributing these for. Selling things as incense or bath salts or not for human consumption or a research chemical that you're not supposed to use. You're supposed to use it for research in your home lab or something like that. So they try to get around the laws with things like this. Lots of these are made in China, maybe some in Eastern Europe. Some people are adventurous and try to do their own home DIY cooking of things, though I don't think that's super common. They ordered online from a variety of sources or dark web and things like that, and they get mailed out. So it's not cartels shipping large quantities around necessarily for most of these. It's small quantities that pop up in little areas because maybe it's bought on the internet. Occasionally it is street level dealers who are distributing, maybe more so with like the spice and things like that we see. But there's other groups where it's pretty much all things that people are getting online for the most part. But occasionally we'll make it into some head shops. This is a big grouping of all the ways we could kind of classify these, and we'll go through each of these different sections here. I won't spend all the time here, but just to show there's lots of ways you can group these. The top half is vaguely similar between stimulants and psychedelics, and then dissociatives. Then sedatives are there, and then we kind of just throw on cannabinoids and related things at the end. And you'll find various similar hierarchies depending on what you look at, but I think it's a fair way to look at it. And we'll go through each of these later on. And these are the ones that I'm picking to go over. Synthetic cannabinoids, like the spice that we're quite familiar with, bath salts, psychedelics, ketamine and its relatives, some of the new benzos that aren't just the ones we're used to, opioids, specifically fentanyl, kratom, if you've run across any of that, and then a few scattered other drugs that come up from time to time. Notably, what this doesn't include is all the plant-based things like mescaline and peyote and other plants and Jimson weed and whatever else people use in mushrooms, things like that don't necessarily fall under this, but that people definitely do abuse. People are creative. This is one thing I learned in toxicology, is that they never cease to amaze how they try to use or abuse drugs. Most of these are ingested, but I think the only ones that are really routinely smoked is spice, because the only thing that really comes like a plant material meant to be smoked. Lots of them are in pill form and can be ingested, but then a lot of the psychedelics harken back to other days of LSD, and they're still provided on blotter paper. No reason they have to be, but they're potent in pretty small quantities, so they can be. Pretty rare for people to want to inject most of these, and it's usually either ingestion. A few can be vaped, that is heated and vaporized rather than smoked like people do with e-cigarettes as well, but not as common. Most of them that come in powder form could be snorted. Kind of an unpleasant way to do drugs, apparently. And we do get some fun times with people deciding to try vaginal or rectal administration, because maybe it'll be different or better or shorter high or different high. I don't know what drives you to do that, but people try just about everything. Like I said, we never know what someone took. So we always want to recognize toxidrome. Is this a term people are familiar with? I hear sometimes you give talks like this and people have never heard the word. To me, it's a toxic syndrome, right? Just a constellation of clinical signs and symptoms that we can use to describe something that kind of fit with a certain set or class of drugs. And that's what a lot of these are going to be, because even if a patient tells you something, you may have no idea, or it may be the opposite of what they thought. The sympathomimetic, so sympathetic nervous system all revved up. That's typified by increased heart rates, elevated blood pressure, and then the most ominous finding for me is hyperthermia. It's not fever because you're fighting an infection and your brain has decided to try to roast the bacteria out of there, but usually because you've completely lost your ability to regulate your own temperature. You're generating so much heat that you can't sweat enough to cool off, kind of like a drug-induced heat stroke, so to speak. Pupils be dilated, might be sweaty, diaphoretic, and then there's the whole continuum of their mental status, from just mild agitation and confusion to florid hallucinations and delirium, and then the worst of that being seizures that they might have. I think it's always best to have an example. So we got to watch a video. It should load up in just a second. You may have seen this one. It's a common one that goes around the internet as far as an agitated person. And I don't know, I don't have as many of these brought to me at the university. Maybe they're going to Salt Lake Regional or LDS, or I don't know, staying closer to downtown maybe, and you don't come up to the U. This is not Utah, by the way. I assume this is somewhere in the Midwest.
Come on, man. Sit down.
It's a normal response. That's how you get away from the police. You punch a hole through a fence, climb through it. Makes sense. You're going to get pepper sprayed about 5 times, 8 or 9 different officers, and he doesn't want to stop. It's hard to tell here, but he's already covered in blood from whatever else he had done before this. Anyone ever had a patient like this? You're called to a scene as someone this agitated? Once or twice, probably, huh? What do you think you might have taken? PCP. Yeah, PCP is probably what this guy did. Unfortunately, we don't have lots of that here. That's got some still niche markets in the Midwest where it hangs out. But if I had to guess anything, I would assume this guy took PCP and doesn't know what's going on. He's going crazy. But people can do lots of things. I had lots of fun searching the internet for fun videos of people doing stuff. This lady at the top is probably just drunk. 2 smashes of the can against the head, tried to skateboard off the roof. Didn't work too well. This guy, I don't know, this is like on some TV show, but this dude right here in the Hawaiian shirt is tripping balls, and it looks like he's not having too much fun, doesn't know what's happening. Yeah, maybe he was choking. That got to keep a broad differential for what's going on. Might have been choking, might be tripping. And then I don't know what circumstances lead you to an ER in a bunny suit, but it was a fun night, I guess. Didn't end the way you wanted, but these are the kind of patients I imagine when I think of sympathomimetics. So I suppose the top one might just be alcohol, but who knows? These are the patients we're dealing with that you're seeing that are not behaving appropriately, which is why you're getting involved, and we have to figure out what's going on. On the other side, I have the sedative, hypnotic, and or opioid toxic drug. I don't have cool videos of this because there wouldn't be much to see except for a patient lying there. Vital signs here are pretty vague, right? I wouldn't expect heart rate or blood pressure to be terribly high. I wouldn't expect it to necessarily be hypotension or bradycardia. Pupils are normal, sometimes small. The only thing that really gets specific is opioids, right? Causing meiosis, small pupils, and then respiratory depression, hypoxia. But there's a huge list of other things that might just make you sleepy, and everything else seems to be okay. And so it can be very difficult to know what someone may or may not have taken. Like I said, we have to keep things broad of don't always assume everything's an overdose. It's a common question. We get someone, calls to the poison center. The patient is on this medication or might have been exposed to this. And we hear about what's going on. We say, well, actually, I don't really think that fits. I don't want you to hang your hat on that. You need to think about X, Y, and Z as well. So always keep in mind that agitated patient, is this something heat-related illness, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, infectious things? Are there much you would do about much of this pre-hospital? Not necessarily. Psychiatric disease. Always have to consider the possibility of trauma, alcohol withdrawal, and the like. On the other hand, for a sleepy or sedated patient, might they have just had a seizure, and now they're post-ictal and very drowsy as they're waiting to come about. Again, CNS trauma or a stroke that may have caused it. I think blood sugar in any patient who has some change in their mental status is warranted, right? Whether they be confused and delirious or more sedated, to make sure it's not just hypoglycemia that we're missing. Hypoxia or retaining CO2 probably would be evident from pretty quickly from other history and other physical exam things you're doing of listening to their lungs and seeing what their SATs are. But And then we have to throw in some other toxicology things like carbon monoxide in there that still happen, though the clinical setting might be more obvious to you than of multiple people in a home or something. When I said supportive care, these are the things you guys are pros at. This is what we do in the emergency department all the time too, is I don't always know what's happening with the patient, but I know I can kind of correct the bad things going on and then figure out where they need to go, either go home or get admitted to the hospital. So I kind of continue the same thing you're doing. Get them safely to their next destination, and if I figure out what's going on in the meantime, that's great. If not, oh well. So it's the ABCs, right? If the patient is not maintaining their airway, gurgling on all their secretions, I can do a variety of things to open their airway or put in a nasopharyngeal airway or oral airway, intubate them, King Airways or whatever else you might have. I can bag them and give them naloxone to wake them up. From a circulatory and cardiovascular standpoint, if they're hypotensive, we can give fluids. And then I lump everything else cardiac in there, right? They're having a dysrhythmia, they're tacking away, I can do ACLS, they're bradycardic, I can take care of that. All those algorithms that you know of under ACLS. And then from a neurologic standpoint, patient's having a seizure or has had a seizure, and give them some midazolam or lorazepam, whatever you have, and then otherwise sedate them per your protocols. If they're too hot, I can cool them down. If they're cold, I can warm them up. Well, that'll get you through 90% of maybe of medicine in general, but definitely on the novel psychoactive substances end of things. That if you don't know, that's okay, and we can figure it out.
So,
Yeah.
Studies a lot more ketamine for agitated delirium type patients. You have someone who's hot because they're taking
Yeah, no, I think it would be okay. I mean, we're using, more and more places are using ketamine. I don't know what Salt Lake protocols are for, what do you guys have?
We don't carry ketamine.
No ketamine. What do you use? Is it midazolam, Haldol, or what, any antipsychotic you carry? Nothing, just midazolam. Okay. Every place has been different. Every place I've been of what they do or don't have, and some places are whole hog on ketamine, and I'm not terribly convinced that whole ketamine is the answer if you have it and it's part of your protocol is what I can say. I don't think there's a contraindication. It's the same worries of everything with ketamine, of hypersalivation, seems to have more need for intubation. Is that due to just because they're dissociated rather than actual respiratory depression? But not I don't think it would. We say ketamine can raise heart rate and blood pressure, but it probably has some ceiling effect. And if someone's already crazy, ketamine's not going to push that through. It should, if anything, take them down. I can give anyone enough ketamine to pretty much induce general anesthesia and just make you do nothing, which I can get there many ways, benzos or ketamine or whatever else it is. If you're bored and want to read about things, these are the fun places to go. Hop on Reddit. Research Chemicals is not a biochemistry lab resource. This is for people who are researchers, and they discuss the use of various chemicals they buy online and their effects and things. So you can read about all sorts of things. Like, they know far more detail about any of these drugs than me. Well, they'll break out each category by different ones. It says this one does this, but this one does that, and this other one lasts longer. And I like a certain headspace it gives me. You can read about this stuff forever, and it's very interesting. Read people's trip reports and things like that. Arrowhead is the classic. This was started by a couple in Berkeley in like the 70s, 80s, and they put it on the web eventually in the 90s. And they're kind of the grandfather of finding information about drugs. And their whole idea was giving people information about the substances they were using. Not as a saying all drugs are safe, but having people make informed choices about the use and dangers. So it's a pretty cool website. Blue Light's just another online web forum where people discuss things. And then Psychonaut Wiki is pretty much the Wikipedia of drugs of abuse. So if you want to pull that up and type in something someone says they took, I'll tell you all about it. Pretty fascinating resources. We do have official resources too. Poison centers, wherever you're working, will often track data locally. It is super hard to get data on this kind of stuff because We can't identify it. Labs often can't test for it. And law enforcement is always one step behind in figuring out what it is we're actually dealing with. So we don't have lots of data. I'll share some of what we do have. The DEA actually has a really great system called NDUS, or National Drug Early Warning System. Again, if you're bored and need something to read, you can hop on their website and read about all the reports they put out. They put out a quarterly report about they put out an emerging threats report, and they will say, here are all the things that we have seized and found, and here's the new drugs that we're finding. Sometimes we have no idea what they are. The lab can identify it far before we actually know what it does to a patient, but we can kind of guess based on similarity to other compounds. And then you can get local data from local authorities, which I'll share some with you in just a moment. So here's the big picture. The Utah Drug Monitoring Initiative was established, I think, 2016, 2017, in response to the opioid epidemic by the governor. I think it actually has legislation behind it, but it's the State Department of Public Safety, the State Health Department, the Poison Control Center, and then SIAC, the State Intelligence and Analysis Center. We gather all this data so we can all figure out what's going on. So the health department includes medical examiner data as well as public health things, and we've got lots of information. Big picture stuff, maybe you went into this thinking I'm going to take care of gunshot wounds and stabbings and terrible car accidents and things, and maybe I thought that too going into emergency medicine. All that stuff is going down or is stable-ish, and then drug poisoning is way up there. So that's what we see more and more of, not that you needed this graph to tell you that. What is happening? Like I said, I don't have data on these individual drugs because they're so hard to track, but we know that I thought this was most interesting, that the combination, so this is from the medical examiner, fatalities, they do some pretty cool drug testing on all of the drug overdose fatalities or suspected overdose fatalities. And I thought it was interesting that people are more and more dying from combinations of probably prescription and then illegal drugs, which encompasses all the things we're talking about, but more often your heroin and meth and whatnot. Yes. Good question. I don't know the answer. I'd have to double check and see, and I don't know, because that obviously is its whole category itself of, alcohol-related car accidents. This is medical examiner things. I suspect this is more overdose rather than alcohol directly, but I don't know.
Is this all ages?
Yeah, this is everybody. I don't have pediatric specific data for this. Our fatalities may be going down a bit in Utah from our peak, though more drug arrests have happened. So that's kind of the big picture. We know that drug poisoning is a big problem in Utah, just like the rest of the country. So what do these look like, right? If you're there and someone has some paraphernalia, has some stuff around them, has some pills with them, their friend says, here's what they took, what are you even going to see, or what might you expect, or what are things going to look like? Some might actually come in a form that looks like a pill. This is one called a Tizalam. I'll zoom in for you. I don't know if it's actually real. It's got a dabbing panda on it. So I don't know that that's one that you go pick up at Walgreens. And this is a drug that's actually not available in the United States, but people can buy it. So it might actually come in a pill that looks like a pill, and you might not know the difference from looking at it quickly. Blotter paper, like I mentioned. So here's the LSD. That's 1P LSD is just an analog of LSD where they act on another atom to change it up. So it just could be a little square of blotter paper. The nebulous white powder, which could be anything. This is allegedly fentanyl in this photo, but who knows, most anything could be a white powder in the end. And very rarely will it be actual plant material. Spice generally is, though it's not actually marijuana. I didn't have a big picture of it. It's we'll go into that next, but synthetic cannabinoids, first known as spice or K2, probably 10 years ago, started in Europe and then I think in Germany and then came to the US. These are all synthetic. It has nothing to do with the marijuana plant at all. And what they did is, back in the 60s and 70s, we were doing a lot of research into how does marijuana work, how does THC work, how can we study it in mice and little petri dishes, and so they were coming up with chemicals that they could use to do research. And so people published their scientific work, in scientific journals, and then people have gone back and looked at their methods and said, I can make that in my lab. Let's make it and smoke it and see what happens. Which seems to be, I don't know, not an approach I take to much of anything in life, of smoke it and see what happens, but many of these patients do. And that's where a lot of them have come from. They're cheap and mostly legal, though we're playing a game of whack-a-mole, and lots have been scheduled, and China continues to schedule some, and the US DEA schedules some. The purported reason to use these over cannabis or marijuana is that they don't show up on a drug screen. And I think Utah, we probably see more than our fair share just because we have less marijuana available. Not that marijuana is in short supply by any means, but I was in Oregon before I was here, and there's a dispensary in every corner in Portland. There's no shortage of weed, and I maybe remember one case of someone using spice while I was in Oregon because no one had any reason to. But in Utah, it's not quite as readily available. So this, when you see that plant material that's in that little package that's marketed as incense or whatever it may be, it's whatever sort of plant material, grass clippings or anything it could be. You just spray the chemical on there just to give it the appearance of an incense, or it's like you're smoking weed. And users generally know this is not marijuana. The effects, though, are super tough. Like, what do we see? This graph on the right is not meant to have you look at all these names. This is from one of those DEA emerging threat reports where they detail all the things they're finding. So what could kids be getting into? Well, here's 25 different synthetic cannabinoids that the DEA has seized in 2018. Which one is the one that is in the spice that they smoked this time? Nobody knows. What effects are you going to see? Again, nobody knows. There was a good outbreak that made the news like a year or two ago in New York City of the zombie bums. Like there's this, I don't know, place where a bunch of homeless folks were living in an abandoned building, and then they were all just like stumbling around down the streets. And they traced it back to this one new kind of synthetic cannabinoid or spice that had come up, and they weren't agitated and crazy. They were kind of stuporous and stumbling around. So you never know exactly what will happen. I know we had a question about what happens if patients had a seizure from smoking spice and then they seem to have returned to baseline by the time you make it there on scene. Like, well, that fits. I think seizures are not common, but the most common effects we would see from spice would be sort of the stimulatory ones of tachycardia and hypertension, some agitation, psychosis, kind of the very extreme pull of what cannabis would do, starting with mild paranoia and anxiety all the way up. So it would fit to have a patient smoking spice and having a seizure. I still think that's a patient I would evaluate just like any other who had had a seizure. What's their blood sugar, probably need transport to the hospital so we can check their electrolytes and sodium and probably CT scan their head and things like that. So could fit, but I would treat it the same way with benzodiazepines. And on the flip side, like I said, we had that outbreak in New York City where they were all stumbling around. There have been some reports of bradycardia and slow heart rates. There was an outbreak that some of my colleagues in Oregon had helped investigate in Alaska where they all got kidney failure after using a particular kind of spice. So we never know what the next drug is going to do, and it's super unpredictable, which I know is not a satisfying answer, but I guess that's the thing to know is who knows what these could do. Like I said, there's the management. This is going to be a recurring theme out of all these slides is pay attention to our ABCs. If you think they need to wake up more, you could try naloxone. If you think they need to be sleepier, give them your benzo of choice.
One question is, like polysubstance, if they take a stimulant and like an opioid, by giving them the naloxone, you're decreasing that depression and increasing the stimulation. Let's say you're not ready, you got to give naloxone, but if you're kind of on the fence, is there a risk of giving the naloxone and letting that stimulant run away?
That's a really good question. What do we do with polyingestions of stimulants and opioids? There's been some people who thought that tramadol, for instance, tramadol is one of these weird opioids that also is associated with seizures. And if you give those patients naloxone, are they more likely to have a seizure? I think just like you said, that if you think the patient needs naloxone, then you give it to them. Might that uncover some underlying stimulant ingestion too? Yeah. Could we have pushed the opioid too far and now they're having some degree of opioid withdrawal with it? Sure. I don't personally think it's a big problem, right? Under what circumstance would you ever give someone morphine or fentanyl to treat their seizure? Like, we don't use those things. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that taking away the opioid would really, cause the seizure. It might show you the stimulant activity, and might they just by coincidence have a seizure after that? So short answer is, I think it's always fine to use naloxone if you think the patient needs it. Cathinones or bath salts. Anyone encountered much of these? It's kind of tapered off a little bit. I was in Ohio when these were around, and I remember having patients on the psychiatry unit that were just delusional and psychotic for days after having used some of these compounds. They still pop up every now and again where someone says, I bought bath salts and took those. A lot of them are illegal, and a lot of states took their own action to make them illegal after this huge outbreak. This was blamed for things like the zombie face eating in Florida, which turns out to probably not be related to bath salts at all. Not that bath salts are good, but probably doesn't cause people to eat someone's face. Did I have a hand in the back or no?
Just on the slide, I apologize in particular fit for this question. Is there any data that indicates the increased deaths you showed on the chart previous may actually be related to suicide?
I didn't have manner of death from any of those of what was the intent? Were these deliberate overdoses, accidental, suicidal, or otherwise? So that's a good question of, is the change from one thing or another? So I don't have that level of detail. I pulled this from the report that the whole group put out, and kind of each individual agency supplies its own data up. So from the Poison Center, we gave Poison Center data. The medical examiner gives theirs, and so good question. I don't have the answer. The bath salts, here's some street names you could hear of. Hexen. To me, I don't know if anyone played video games in the 90s. This was a Quake Doom type of game, and now it's named as a drug there. Ephelone. I don't know how to pronounce BKEBDP, but that's the common shorthand that I kept coming across as I was looking at this. And again, this is one where there's 15 different ones that the DEA continually seizes, and there's one or two that keep falling out at the top. Where will we be in another year? Who knows? Maybe we'll switch to something else. I subscribe to an email list where some of the labs that work with DEA to detect new compounds, like once a week, I get an email saying, we have detected this new compound that is one thing different from the last one. No data is available on effects in humans, but here's what the chemical structure looks like. Good luck. So these are always evolving. These are related to amphetamines, is about the closest I could put it. It's somewhere going to be like Adderall or meth or MDMA, and their effects will be somewhere in there with some mix of agitation and seizures and hallucinations and psychosis. It's all the sympathomimetic toxidrome. So what does that get us for treatment? The same things: aggressive sedation, benzos, and then other sedation by your local protocols, whether that's Versed or ketamine or Haldol or Geodon or whatever you happen to have. I do think that these patients are ones that would be pretty prone to being very agitated more than some of the others, more than I might expect someone with spice. I think these are the patients that could be taking 6 of you and your colleagues to pin them down and tying them down and getting a lot of IM meds, that I think patients could fall into this category using bath salts. I say cathinones because that's chemically what they are. It doesn't matter. Bath salts is fine by me for referring to them like that. These were marketed as bath salts that you're supposed to put in the bath. Again, not for human consumption, trying to use that loophole. So it seems like everyone comes up with something else, an incense or a bath salt or whatever else, or a research chemical. There's always a new way to say this isn't for people to use, and thus we're not breaking the law. Psychedelics. I picked this name. People often use hallucinogens. Users of these compounds say psychedelics is more appropriate because most of the time they're not having actual hallucinations of things that aren't there. Rather, it's heightening emotions and experiences and senses and things like that, and make them have another experience with the world. And I've had a few patients recently like, I did some acid and then I've decided to come to the ER today to get my life together. And I'm like, that's great. You figured everything out, and now you're going to get into treatment or do whatever else from the last time that didn't work out. But they seem to, it's a lot of introspection, and which is why it's getting explored for PTSD and depression and pain and all sorts of other things. That can you come to terms with yourself. In any case, there are lots and lots of different compounds available that have all of these varied effects beyond that I can give you descriptions of. But if you want to read about the best thing and what people prefer, hop on some of the websites I listed before. I will say that patients will often say they took either LSD or Molly or MDMA, not really having any idea if it was those true classic compounds or if it's any of dozens of slightly related but different and thus unpredictable drugs. But people are, unless they specifically know, and I intended to buy this thing on the internet and here's the chemical name, which they usually will and can sometimes tell you exactly what it was, that if they just say, oh yeah, it was Molly, who knows what they actually took. Molly being a street name for MDMA or ecstasy, right? Those last three being all the same there. Here are a couple. This is, I think, the biggest category. N-bomb or 25I had popped up. I haven't seen much of this recently. I had a few cases of I remember I had a 14-year-old boy in Portland who did this, who bought it on the internet, and then his brother managed to inform the ICU team of what he took, and so they called me and said, what is this? I was like, wow, how did you know you had that? No one ever knows. And they said, oh, well, you bought it on the internet, and this is what's happening. And I think he had severe agitation and delirium and ended up getting himself so sedated they ended up intubated by the end of everything else, but then woke up a day or two later in the hospital and told us what he did. Ended up fine. But there are lots of 2C compounds. They swap out one atom. The I is iodine, the B is bromine, Cl could be chloride, swap out one atom for another. Tryptamines, DMT is quite old and is around in things in like ayahuasca and stuff like that. But then we have some novel things like bromo dragonfly, where they've taken the long chemical name and turned it into something fun to say. And then we'd have, like I showed you, that LSD and the LSD analogs where they tack on one extra atom. There's lots of these. What they all have in common is they all work via serotonin. Not that that does much for you, but that's the common neurotransmitter for everything that isn't psychedelic or hallucinogen in nature, is via serotonin. While the other stimulants, like the amphetamines, are norepinephrine and dopamine. If you don't want to think about any of that, you don't have to. I like to think about it. Yeah. So that probably is, again, we don't have good data like we do when people are switching from one SSRI to another, and we know they need to decrease their dose. And so if someone is on antidepressant and taking those as well, I think they would have a higher risk for some of these effects, because generally these are all pretty well tolerated by themselves, but I think you're exactly right. You combine them with something else, you're going to have more risk of serotonin syndrome, which we'll say in just a second. Yeah.
Question on the DMT with dimethyltryptamine. We've seen a few of those laboratories here in Southern.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
That makes sense. We've seen a couple of pediatric. Rather offended. What is their duration of that period of facility to I'm just curious what you've experienced. If we do supportive care, they're so offended that they buy it through eventually.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that'd be my first thought from DMT as a psychedelic, that it should be a bit more stimulating, generally short acting, but yeah. So I wonder what else is like, what did they actually take? Because that wouldn't have been my first guess. When you said DMT, I wasn't expecting to say obtunded and then intubated. So to me, that immediately goes, I'm not sure. That doesn't fit what I would expect from DMT necessarily, and the duration of that too. And then again, all goes to dose. Do they know how much they're supposed to take, and they took way too much, and that pushes them so far that they're just so out of their mind that they're doing nothing? But usually when we have serotonergic agents that go that far, they're agitated and tachycardic and hyperthermic, and then eventually had some seizures and they become comatose. But I don't know. I would suspect something else besides just plain old dimethyltryptamine. I think most of these kids don't make it to see you or to us in the ER because they mostly do okay until they take too much or start having a bad experience and get really anxious and paranoid and start freaking out. And so I think it often ends up being these adolescents who are first timers or haven't done it too much and they don't have as much experience with it. And so they end up doing that. And maybe they take too much and all the alcohol on top of it compounds things. So usually they're fine, and a little benzodiazepine will calm them down and trying to reassure them that whatever crazy things they're visualizing or seeing aren't real and everything's going to be okay. And they can hang out in the dark room in the ER once they get there and relax. And usually they'll be fine in a few hours, which goes against my DMT. Right? This is not what I expect for those. Worst case scenario being the same as all these others for stimulants or the toxidrome of hyperthermia and agitation and seizures and things like that. Next group, similar but different, dissociatives, ketamine and PCP. I spent some time like trying to remind myself, like, what is actually the difference? Having never taken anything, I don't believe I've ever had ketamine. Not that anyone told me, right? But that ketamine and PCP are supposed to induce a dissociative state. That's why we use them for anesthesia, for sedation, for intubation, that your brain is still connected and you still breathe, but you kind of stop receiving sensory input. So in contrast to other psychedelics that are heightening the colors and sounds and emotion that you're having, the dissociatives disconnect you and you go into the void or into the K-hole, and like you're in and out of existence. Read some trip reports. You get like very colorful things people describe. PCP, we don't see very much of that. PCP is unique, and like the gentleman who was in the video at the beginning was pretty agitated and upset. We did have I had a case of this, of the 2-fluoro-deschloroketamine, which is ketamine, and then just swap out one atom. And he took too much, had a seizure, and then had respiratory depression and got intubated overnight. And then he woke up and said, "Oh no, I've taken that like 3 times. But last night I decided to take twice as much as normal." So who knows what happened? And went too far that then I guess he pushed himself so far that it looks like he lost his airway. He was a little bit cyanotic when you guys arrived. This is the partial effect, right? Anyone using this for pain here? No? You guys use it for pain? Yeah. Yeah. I hear the flight crews tell us they're using it for pain and things sometimes, and depending on who's coming, so always different. So ketamine's a very odd drug of controls pain in between. If you get a little bit higher doses, these partial dissociative effects that people use recreationally, and then going higher doses, we get to the full dissociating dose where they're unresponsive. Sometimes say GCS3K, right? It's ketamine that's making me totally unresponsive and unaware of what's happening.
Ketamine a very short life.
Yeah. Yeah, generally wears off pretty fast. I don't know what to say about any of these new analogs. Does swapping that make it hang out in the brain any shorter or longer? I've got no idea. My experience with this one guy a month or 2 ago who did this was fine the next morning. Pretty short duration that it had, but yeah, ketamine normally doesn't hang out too long.
What demographic do you think uses ketamine recreationally?
I think this is the same group of the adolescents too, 18 to 30. Not much older than that people are doing that. I think this guy was in his mid-20s, my one case that we had recently. What are the effects? Produces some mild tachycardia and hypertension, not usually anything terribly exciting. As far as the degree of tachycardia and blood pressure, the reason we are using it for so much is their respiratory drive is supposed to be intact, right? That they still breathe on their own, that they don't have to be intubated, but Sometimes it goes far enough that they are. It's in combination with some benzos and some alcohol and whatever else, and then that pushes it too far. Hypersalivation is one to be aware of. I have no idea if it's associated with any of the new ones or not. I definitely see that sometimes from ketamine, which can be troublesome if you're not breathing so well and now your secretions are building up. Nystagmus is quite common with PCP and ketamine. They're just spontaneously just seeing their eyes bouncing back and forth. Same management as all of these, nothing different. If they're very CNS depressed, again, naloxone's reasonable. Try to wrap up these last few quickly. We're familiar with things like Versed or Xanax or Klonopin as the normal benzodiazepines, but then there's all these new compounds that are kind of weird, and they're related. They're not technically benzodiazepines, but that doesn't matter too much. So you can see there's similarities in the names there. Flubromazole, flualprazolam, where again they're just swapping in another couple atoms here and there and changing things up. The atizolam, with the panda on it and the blue pills that I showed you earlier, is an example of that. Another thing I think is good to remind us about is it actually Xanax? I don't know if it's happened here. We definitely had a host of these when I was in Portland of what we suspected were not actually Xanax. People know them and are popular for people to sell on the street, the Xanny bars, but they may just actually buy a pill press on the internet and then take whatever pharmaceutical compound they get, stamp it into pill and sell it. And because it says Xanax, people are like, oh, great, I want Xanax, but who knows what it actually is. This I stole this slide from a guy who works for Pfizer, one of the big drug companies, and their fake drug task force going out and looking for false pharmaceuticals that they actually sell and working with the DEA. So API is active pharmaceutical ingredient. People buy the drug from China, go spend $100 on this. And you see there's the pill press that someone had in the room in their house, and they were just doing their own little DIY pill mill and selling them there. So if someone says they bought some Xanax and took it, who knows if it actually was that or not. Benzos, not terribly exciting. I would expect from all these novel ones to do the same thing. Duration of action and everything, of course, is going to be who knows, but mild sedation and CNS depression, and then, as we normally see with benzos, less respiratory depression compared to an opioid. Same thing for management. Naloxone just in case, because who knows if what they took or bought is actually Xanax, and maybe it was fentanyl that someone sold them instead. It's definitely happened. Flumazenil, I don't know, is this in anyone's protocols to be using flumazenil? I wouldn't think so. And I would have a hard time recommending it with all the other stuff that could be happening. Personally, I'm more happy to use it, but even docs in the ED who are calling me were usually saying, maybe, maybe not. In the pediatric population who is naive, this is more of our toddlers getting into things than our adolescents experimenting. So flumazenil you can just cross off of there, I think. And then let's wrap up with some opioids and then have some more question time. Most of the heroin that you guys encounter, brown tar, does that about add up as what you see? That's what I hear, is it's mostly all brown tar heroin from Mexico. The white powder heroin in the U.S. is primarily from Colombia and goes up through the East Coast, though both try to get into each other's territories and things crisscross a little bit. We have very little fentanyl, at least in comparison to states in the Midwest and East, where all of the heroin is pretty much guaranteed to have fentanyl. Generally from dealers who are cutting it in at the street level to increase their yields, because fentanyl is super cheap and it's super potent, and you can get a 1 little kilogram package in the mail, and that's thousands of doses instead of needing an entire truck full of heroin or meth or something else. This is bought from the internet, most of it coming from China. Like I said, it can be found in counterfeit pills as well. So you can see it, patients knowing they're buying fentanyl. There's some interesting surveys of drug users of some that say, like, I know there's fentanyl in this heroin I buy, and I buy it because of that. Or I think I've had fentanyl because it was stronger, or I bought a test kit that they gave me at somewhere, and I tested it and it had fentanyl in it, but I decided to try it anyway. So there's a whole range of whether people do or don't know fentanyl is around. I think the brown tar heroin should not, because it's not easy to mix other stuff into it. But if it's not brown tar heroin, could it be regular, just plain heroin, or could it have fentanyl in it? Who knows? And then these counterfeit pills that are sold as oxys on the street or Xanax, could it actually contain fentanyl because it's so cheap to acquire? Maybe so. But we actually have some data. There is fentanyl popping up. You may not know it. I may not know it in the ER either. But this is mostly medical. Well, on the left is medical examiner, where fentanyl was involved in the overdose. Again, the information I need to get from the medical examiner on a lot of these things is, would this include things like patients who have cancer and are wearing a fentanyl patch and then have an accidental overdose? Or is this most of it? My impression from some of the meetings I've been at with them that it's mostly the latter of accidental or of overdoses of illicit fentanyl rather than I was using a fentanyl patch or something like that. The analogs are all these related compounds to fentanyl. You've probably heard of things like carfentanil and stuff like that, but the vast majority of fentanyl still is just fentanyl. It's made in China, so it's not people stealing it from the hospital pharmacy or anything else. It's shipped in from out of the country, but most of it is still the plain fentanyl. So there has been some, and I don't know the circumstances that led to this big jump in the crime lab submissions last year, but apparently law enforcement was hard at work and came across a whole bunch of fentanyl. In the Poison Center, we've been pretty scattered. This is how many contacts over the course of a year. So that's like a phone call a month or so that we were getting at the Poison Center. Not coming up a lot. I think primarily because no one knows if it's ever involved or not, because they look just like an opioid overdose, right? Unless we happen to have more information. Here's the compare. 166 fatal heroin overdoses, 1,300 submissions to the crime lab. You compare that, that was 30 and 30 and 30 there for fentanyl. So heroin still dwarfs what's going on, and we don't have the data about hospital visits for fentanyl because it's hard to get that specific. But heroin and meth compared to all these, far dwarf all of them. Probably not so much in our pediatric population if we're calling this a pediatric talk today. Probably more likely to see these others in the kids. Opioids, naloxone, right? Pretty straightforward. You get asked about this sometimes. What about the dosing if you suspect fentanyl? Let's say you think it's an opioid, then you titrate to effect. I don't think people are routinely eating 20 milligrams because they're so potent. My theory, whether if it matters or not, is heroin users overdose because they accidentally take too much, and they're pretty habituated and they know what it takes to get them high. So they're usually not overdoing it and trying to kill themselves. But if you're getting into fentanyl, there's no quality assurance from your dealer on how much fentanyl you put in your heroin. And so in that case, you could overdose 10 times as much as you meant to because you have no idea what's in there. And I think that's the reason these patients need, you hear someone needing 10 or 20 milligrams of naloxone. So I think the majority of patients with fentanyl are still going to respond to fairly standard doses. Certainly if you get to 10 milligrams, you really got to think it's something else besides the opioid contributing to how they're doing at that point. But, if you've given 2 intranasal, 2 IM, and still nothing else is going on, at that point you're going to have to be moving on to other things if the patient's still not breathing well on their own. Can I overdose from touching fentanyl? I don't know, has this come up for you guys at all or heard about this of what happens if I get near the fentanyl? Yeah. So this popped up from the DEA, and they put out some national videos on it a couple of years ago. And then toxicologist, and my disclosure is I helped write a statement for the American College of Medical Toxicology on what should we do? Can you overdose on fentanyl from touching it? What's the risk? You responding to an overdose, and someone says you think it was fentanyl. Oh, you shouldn't stop and wait for hazmat and suit up in level A gear before you go in and take care of the patient who's not breathing, right? You really can't overdose on fentanyl from touching it. Fentanyl patches are specially formulated in special goo, and it has to sit on your skin for hours in direct contact, and then it slowly makes it into your skin. So if you have powder that's dry, you brushed it off and washed your hands, that'd be fine. If you're wearing gloves like you're probably doing in these situations, that's good protection. If you were somehow in an area where there was a large amount, there was a lab and they were distributing it and it was out there and it was dispersed into the air all over, that might be a different scenario. But if someone is suspected to have used fentanyl and they have some around them, I would take care of the patient. If you're going to be cleaning up an entire drug lab, I think it's a different story.
So we watched that DEO video for the testimony of one officer that had baggage or something, white powder on the skin, and he lost consciousness. So what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I've seen, seems like there's a report at least once a week in the lay press and otherwise of someone who was exposed to something. There was a whole thing at, I forget, where a prison where they had 40 correctional officers that were supposedly exposed, and this has happened over and over again. And I have the only published report I know is of one where there is a scenario like this, and none of the folks affected had any opioids in their system. And all these others are describing symptoms that are not so opioid-like. They're saying, I felt like I was going to die, my heart was racing, my vision blacked out, and I felt like I was going to faint, which to me sounds very panic attack-like rather than opioid toxic. And then they get naloxone because what else is someone going to do? And panic attacks resolve on their own. And if someone passed out briefly, then they wake up after they finish hyperventilating. And if they happen to get naloxone in there, was it the naloxone or the fact that they just finished that? And it seems far out of proportion to any exposure that we've ever heard about. And I still have no one that has confirmed any of these. If you ever know of a case, I have made contacts with the state and with CDC that if we ever have a case, we will send samples from everyone, from blood and urine and the actual stuff they're exposed to figure it out. Because if it's happening, you got to change everything, right? And if not, you need to be able to take care of patients and save someone and not sit there waiting to don all this extra gear that might impede the care you're going to give them.
I have a kiddo, actually last week at Primary Children's, that they'd gotten a shipment of stuff from wish.com, which is a direct mail to China. The stuff had Chinese writing all over it.
Yeah.
And the child had put it some kind of toy, it wasn't even a medicine, put it in his mouth, and it was caustic, burnt. The whole mouth, just immediately.
Okay.
And so I can see maybe something along those lines that seem a little more dangerous, but obviously not something that's going to knock you out.
Yeah. Yeah, the one report I know of someone being like semi-incidentally exposed to fentanyl was someone who their friend told them to take a lick of this stuff and it would help treat their pain, and they did, and it was a fentanyl, and they had opioid-like symptoms and overdose, but they had put it in their mouth with the intent to take sufficient to treat their pain, not an incidental exposure on their hands. So, yeah, who knows what they got, of what sort of caustic, alkaline, chemical, or otherwise that could have been. Okay, and then last but not least here will be kratom. Anyone come across this or hear about it? Right? Okay. What sort of scenario did you have? Remember what was happening?
I just wanted to debate the legality of it. So
Okay.
he was a little bit altered, a little bit intoxicated. We were concerned about that, and he just wanted to debate whether it was legal or not. We were trying to assure him that we were concerned about his well-being and not the legality, and he just wanted to debate.
So he was an attorney. He was suggesting.
Yeah.
So he got it in a powder form designed for the teeth.
Yep.
And just started eating it. So he had it all over his hands, all over his gums, just acting, his teeth were green. And then he was delusional, and we were trying to, we're here for your best interest, we want to keep you safe.
Mm-hmm.
And he had enough sense with his legal knowledge that he was trying to
trying to keep you from taking care of him and transporting him.
that was our promotion.
Maybe not the kratom his primary problem there. Well, this has been around for decades, but only in the last few years has it made it to the United States. Traditionally used in Thailand, Malaysia, chew the leaves, somewhat analogous, I suppose, to cocaine, of chewing the leaves for a mild stimulant effect. It's actually been outlawed in Thailand and Malaysia and Australia since the 50s, but still lives on there. And it's a pretty unusual plant, is that it has some mild stimulant properties, but then a higher dose, it actually acts just like an opioid. Pretty weird. Still a lot of ongoing research into exactly what's going on here. Just exactly like you said, consumed in powder or put into teas. People can put it into capsules like this. You can see in here, it may not show up too great, but this is Royal Green Vein Malaysian Kratom. All those different words are supposed to mean things. Like the green vein versus the red vein is better or different for different effects. Apparently it's pretty foul and bitter tasting, so some people just put them in capsules, some make a tea. It sounds like you can smoke it, but not advisable, and most people are ingesting it one way or another. This isn't so much a drug of abuse. I think I would probably less likely for our adolescents to be getting into it, but they might because it's natural or something else, and it's legal. I think it's illegal in like 10 different states. You may vaguely recall the DEA attempted to schedule this about 2 years ago, and there was a huge public outcry that this is what we're using to treat our pain, and if you're going to be worried about the opioid epidemic, then you're going to let us continue having our kratom. Pretty much this is people prescribing themselves their own Suboxone at home from a plant. So it works. It's an opioid. You can get opioid withdrawal if you stop using kratom. It's been pretty well documented. So it is a real thing.
Can they be a response to an outbreak like a true opioid overdose?
Yeah. I don't see why it shouldn't respond to Narcan. The trouble with these is like all the reports we have are mixed in with like 6 different drugs. So there are a lot of deaths from around the country and that the FDA had brought together, and all of them have like 6 other drugs present, and you don't know, was it the kratom or not? I think there are now 1 or 2 that have popped up where the patient had like sky high amounts of kratom in the blood and suspected to be death related to that. But I think it's possible. This causes less respiratory depression, that there's something going on with these different opioids that somehow they do treat some pain but don't cause you to stop breathing quite as much. So that might happen. And I think it'd be unlikely for people to have a pure kratom overdose that looks just like an opioid. If that's what you see, treat the patient with naloxone. I think most often kratom is going to be kind of peripherally involved, and that's usually the question that we get at the Poison Center is, hey, this person was found unresponsive or having multiple seizures or had something else totally unrelated going on, and they said they used kratom. Anything we should do? I'm like, I think that does or does not sound terribly related. It's usually not, I tried to kill myself by ingesting a bunch of kratom, or I accidentally took too much kratom. So that's why I have some question marks. Maybe seizures, maybe stimulant effects. Okay, we talked about that. I'll just leave off this last slide, kind of go back here for these are the overview of everything we just talked about. Cathinone's up there at the top for bath salts. The next section contains a variety of different psychedelics. It's 2C and 25I and DMT and LSD. The dissociatives are PCP and ketamine. On the sedating end of things, we have opioids, specifically fentanyl being the big one, plus kratom now. There are lots of designer benzos out there that may be just as likely to contain an opioid. If people know they bought a Tizolam on the internet and it comes in a little package, I'm fairly confident it's a Tizolam. If you bought Xanax off a dude on the corner, then I'd be more likely to think it was fentanyl rather than Xanax. And then our synthetic cannabinoids, who knows what's in them. My take-home points, never know what they took. We can't test for it, or we can, but it's hard. There's always something new or different, even if we do suspect something. All of our care is mainly supportive. Fentanyl and opioids are abundant, so if they look like an overdose like that, always reasonable to try naloxone. Otherwise, it's all the ABCDEs that we mentioned before. And if you ever have a question about a patient, you're always welcome to give us a call. Try to help you guys out. If you guys have more questions or from our audience at large or anyone here too, happy to chat or chat afterwards as well.
We're going to continue questions in just a minute. I'm going to close out the webinar really quick.
Okay.
So those of you who are in the room get to talk to Dr. Moss further and ask some more questions. Those of you online, please email utah.petos@gmail.com to get your questions for your CME certificates. Thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, if you scan that QR code, it'll let you download the PowerPoint with the camera. Most cameras on the phone should just link straight to the PowerPoint if you want it. I don't know, you guys send it out to them too.
Yes, we will. Sorry, any questions?
Anything else, guys? Any other cases or unusual ones you've had that you want to ask about? Or I don't know, I'm interested on that DMT one now. I'll have to look in to see if anyone said anything about large DMT overdoses. Oh, that's not what I'm supposed to do.
I guess that does kind of prompt the question. The lab is
Yeah.
It was reported that the child got DMT from his friend through that lab. It was difficult to get information back from the hospital. And I know it's difficult to identify this as not.
Yeah.
But in order to make us better providers, what's our best pathway to find out when we're seeing an increase in XYZ shipments for the most part? And if there is a pathway for us to get that information, I think that would be hard to do some of that country.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a pathway for us, I know for
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah, this is tough. This is kind of our like holy grail of what I wish I could do as a toxicologist, right? Is how do I know what's going on in every street corner in town of what's out there right now? You guys are our frontline people, and you're the first ones to see things before law enforcement knows about it, well before I know about things, or even if I have a case and do testing, and I convince the doctors at the hospital to send off the test, it takes 3 weeks to come back. So it's tough to know, and it's also hard to get these things tested because finding out what it is super difficult. Even if you guys say, I think I've seen a cluster, now if you do notice like, hey, we've had like 4 runs recently all around the same type of stuff in this area, I think that'd be a good thing to alert us to or someone else in your chain of command about to see is there something else we can do, because this is what's really tough. Right? Because the state has a crime lab, which they can test physical specimens, but not human samples. But they can only do that if there's a criminal case open and an investigation. And you're probably not terribly excited about having police come to check in on every single one of your patients who's overdosed, and they certainly don't want police there all the time if they don't have to be. And doctors in the hospital don't want the police to come for all their overdose patients because we want people to come and get care from us, not be afraid that law enforcement's going to start getting after them. The public health end of things, right? Public health can help us when there's a food poisoning outbreak, but they can also help us if there's an outbreak like this, but they need some sort of like cluster to be able to decide we're going to open an investigation and try to go get samples and interview patients and do all this stuff. And then ERs, once you bring them into the hospital, they're like, I don't know, he's fine or whatever, I'm going to admit him to the ICU, and off they go. And someone calls us and says, what do you think this is? I was like, I don't know, it sounds like this. You could send off this fancy test that'll come back in 3 weeks. They're like, no, thanks. So it always leaves me in this position and you in that same thing. If I think there's something, but it's really hard to pin down. But if you do have one, I'm almost have something off the ground where we're going to be able to starting from some surveillance. So patients who come in, we're going to take the leftover blood and urine that the ER collects and then send it off just on all these patients without the doctors even having to worry about it. And it's not going to give us a real-time thing, but it might give us a rolling thing over weeks and months of what's happening. That's kind of my pipe dream that I'm almost getting into fruition. So that's a long answer for that is I wish, but I don't have the good answer.
People are noticing patterns, and they call for different people and say, hey, we saw this in firearms in the last week, picked up 3 people with the same symptoms. You guys see anything? I mean, I know we have the DEA kind of alert system, but you guys, if one of your pharmacists got a call, they would pay attention to that, right?
Yeah, no, if we had some where we noticed, like, wow, we've had a bunch of these. That's how we picked up on some in Oregon of some suspected fake Xanax was we just had 3 15-year-olds from one suburban area that showed up with a Xanax overdose. They got intubated. That was weird. So it takes people recognizing patterns, and if you hear about it and tell the poison center and say, hey, we've had a couple of these, they can kick it up to me, and we can see if there's something else that we have resources for to start looking into. But it's tough for all those reasons.
Okay, so high index of suspicion for poison drugs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing I'd like to figure out is what's a good way to communicate back to you guys. I mean, I work with Scott Youngquist, right? At the U, so I don't know the best way to get things back. But right now, I typically don't have that kind of information. Like occasionally we get a one-off thing, and it will come back a few weeks later when I get some information. But by that point, do I know anything else about it? A lot of these are online sorts of research chemicals that one guy bought that, but does that mean that's what everyone else has?
It worked for Scott to do like a quarterly report that can go out in a newsletter. It just says, hey, this is the trend. We have so with all like Sally County, so within Salt Lake County, even have runs, this is what we're seeing. This is anything interesting, and see if we can do it just on a quarterly basis. We can put it in our newsletter. Let's see if Scott and Jack could help get that information out.
And the Poison Center, we rely 100% on people calling us. If someone doesn't call us, we don't know. That's the only way we collect data is from calls that we get. It's my plug to get this call.
I was going to come to the strategic meeting. Sometimes we can try to talk about how can we get more interaction between us, and we've got other things to say that chlorine exposure, where poison filters later when people are out to the hospital. So how do we get earlier reporting, and then how do we get the message back to people? So hopefully we'll get that communication better.
Yeah. More questions? Happy to chat or get in touch by phone or email. I guess I didn't leave my email anywhere up there. Okay, put it on there. I'm happy to talk about any of these or come back and talk in more depth about any one of them. We could spend a whole hour on any one of those whole topics if we really wanted to get nerdy. But.
Yeah. I think one of the things our checking list forgot. Can you just put the way you try to do to it? Or you know, on your
Hey guys, I have one comment about emailing her to get your certificates. It has a really good idea as we're going over to certifying in our EMT with live certificates. And we're going to need to take responsibility for managing your training, a little bit more responsibility for managing your training within our EMT. And so if you can document your own training, you can do it in that. And we're going to include training on that and upload the certificate training. Our EMT really likes that. So that's a good idea.
I don't.